Hi, I'm Larry Brooks, the chairperson of Cancer Active, and we're here today with another show in our 8-day spectacular, Cancer, Why You Are Not Doomed. Okay, a very important subject. And today I'm asking our own Chris Woollams to give us a list of his top 10 off-label drugs. These are the drugs like Metformin, designed for diabetes, but which can find a role in cancer. So being used for something that is not written on the label. And I would say, good morning, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm always fine. I'm very lucky. I always feel well and happy, so there you go.
You're lucky. You're in the warmth and the sunshine of Thailand, whereas we're stuck here in the cold
Yeah,
and the
it's a
wet.
bit grey. It's a bit grey at the moment. It's been a grey day, and also it's about 5:30 at night. So it's good morning to you and good evening to me.
Okay, just one thing I've asked Chris, and that is that this is not a dictionary or a thesaurus or a textbook on these. These are his overviews, brief overviews of his top 10 off-label drugs. So I suppose the first question is, Chris, is it legal to use a drug approved for one illness to treat another illness?
It actually is, yes. But there are some requirements, for example. So the drug must be approved for use with humans. And people don't quite understand sometimes why they can't get fenbendazole, for example. They can only get mebendazole. And it's because it's not fenbendazole is not approved for humans. It's approved for dogs and cats and things like that. That's the first thing. Secondly, it must be prescribed by a licensed doctor. So it doesn't have to be an oncologist, but it does have to be a licensed doctor. And the third thing is, even if you fulfill those two criteria, there's a fair chance the doctor might say, well, hang on, if I'm going to give you off-label drugs, is this still best practice? Because as you probably know, all hospitals deal in best practice, and that's what they want to give you with if you've got cancer. So they might still say, well, yes, okay, I can see this research, I can see it for humans, but I don't know whether I really want to do it. And if you look at America, it's slightly different in America, because America's got far more integrative doctors. There's courses at university now in integrative medicine. And so these people are more likely to say, okay, how do I solve this problem? Does this lady in front of me need hyperbaric oxygen or ozone or something like that? Does she need vitamin D? Does she need hypothermia? And how am I going to cut her blood sugar? How am I going to cut her blood fats and so on? So they're far more likely to say, what is the problem? And therefore, what's the solution? And really, that's much more what I do. I want to make it absolutely clear. I'm not a doctor. I don't prescribe off-label drugs. I happen to suggest them sometime to people. Of course I do. But first of all, I work from a basis that people have built a body conducive to cancer. And actually what I'm trying to do is not treat the cancer. I'm actually trying to help the person build a body conducive to health. And so I start off basically saying, what's the problem here? What's the best thing to suggest to this person in front of me? So that's it. So are they legal in Britain? Yes, they are. But it's not as simple as that.
So using off-label drugs, Chris, just to get me clear, is that safe to do?
Well, I mean, that's the $64,000 question. And you see, you've got to look at it in context of everything. When I interviewed Rob Thomas, who's professor at Addenbrooke's, he suddenly said to me in the middle of the show, he said, do you get people who are already on a lot of drugs? And I said, yes. And we were talking about what you did about it. And it's quite possible to get someone on 8 drugs. I've had a lady with lung cancer who'd never been near a cigarette and so on, and she was on 8 drugs. Now, let's suppose they're on a couple of drugs like blood thinners and something like, or antidepressant. So they're on a couple of drugs. And then the doctor, let's say he only gives them 2 drugs like gemcitabine or cisplatin, a platinum-based drug. And platinum-based drugs have got their own difficulties. So now they're up to 4 drugs. And let's suppose then they want to go and take some off-label drugs, and there's a kind of, as you know, care oncology give people 4 drugs. So now suddenly they're up to 8 drugs. And, I then start worrying about clashes between the drugs, because with the best will in the world, you know, someone who's going to do gemcitabine cisplatin, they're also going to be given dexamethasone. They'll also be given a proton pump inhibitor, something like lansoprazole or omeprazole or something like that. So suddenly it's now 10 drugs. And with Metformin, I'm not too sure these have ever been through a clinical trial. I think people are adding them and we don't know what the interactions are. And I remember once with one of my people having her with no hair, no nails. This was an American lady, and she was on Taxol, for example. And she said to me, you know, how's this happened to me? And I said, well, what supplements do you take? Oh, no, my doctor won't let me have supplements. Okay, they're dodgy things, okay. And I'm looking now at the Taxol homepage, and it was diet. And it said, you mustn't touch grapefruit. You mustn't touch grapefruit juice. You mustn't touch Seville oranges if you're on Taxol. Had the doctor told her that? No. And this was why it's all about something called CYP3A4. It's an enzyme in the body, and it concentrates or dilutes the drug down. So you've got people adding in, oh, let's add in a statin. Well, did you know, for example, that same problem, grapefruit and grapefruit juice and Seville oranges can actually strengthen or weaken a statin. There's also people on antidepressants, and they're talking about antidepressants now becoming off-label drugs. Well, there again, cancer active, we've covered it. Eggs, salami, bacon, ham, all these things actually can make those drugs work much more strongly, or far more likely, much more weakly. So I get very worried about this. I'm not going to comment on whether I know whether the drugs clash, because that's not my department. But all I'm pointing out really is you're starting to take 10 drugs when you do that. Who says they don't crash into each other?
Crazy. You know, there was an Australian study that gave you 4 more years of survival. Why only 4 years?
That's a really interesting question. My number one off-label drug is definitely Atorvastatin. The American brand name for it is Lipitor. And what was interesting about this to me was that we've got lots of research on Atorvastatin. So let me just explain something to people watching. Basically, I know this is controversial. I really accept it, but tumors feed on sugar. And when they go to spread, about 9 out of every 10 cells goes into the lymph and starts to burn fat. It changes. And cancer cells need a little bit of fat to cause angiogenesis, new blood supplies. They stick to new blood supplies. And also they need fat for all those new membranes. And we know, for example, women on low-fat diets with breast cancer survive longer. And we also know that people who've got high blood fats actually get more metastasis and survive least. So it's a really good idea to lower your blood fats. But there are 2 sorts of statins. There's lipophilic and hydrophilic. And lipophilic statins actually cross membranes. They get into tissues, and that's much more relevant to cancer than a hydrophilic one. So we know lipophilic statins are really good news. So Atorvastatin is probably number 1. Lipitor, there's simvastatin, and there's a couple of others. So when you're going to get a statin for cancer, you want to have a lipophilic one. Now, there's lots of research on Atorvastatin. It's increasing all the time. And, you know, with the caveat that the statin boys like to do research which says statins are wonderful, with the caveat, we do have research, for example, on prostate cancer, and statins, Atorvastatin does actually reduce aggressive and fatal prostate cancer risk. So that sounds pretty good. And we've got research on breast cancer and so on. But there was a big study, I think it was the best one of the lot. It was done in Australia on women who had melanoma, colorectal cancer, or they had breast cancer. And these women got 4 years on average, more survival, longer survival, if they happen to be on Lipitor. And everybody's going, well, it's fantastic. Well, yes, it is. But I asked the question the other way around. Why did they only get 4 years extra survival? Because it's not a drug. It's not attacking the cancer cell. So you're not going to get chemo resistance. So it must be doing something else. And we know that when you take a statin, you lower the coenzyme Q10 level, and people can get myopathy, which is weak muscles. Yes, if you took it for 8 years, you might get dementia even, but we know that when you take a statin, it can lower coenzyme Q10 levels. And we know that coenzyme Q10 levels, if they're low, you get a higher risk of cancer. And secondly, if you've got cancer and you've got low CoQ10, you get far more advancement. We've got research on breast cancer. So what I started to think was happening was it only gave you 4 years more survival because actually it was lowering the coenzyme Q10 at the same time. And then I found research from the Mayo Clinic and research from Sloan Kettering saying people taking lipophilic statins should take coenzyme Q10. So with my patients, I always say, well, if you're going to take a statin, I think it's a really good idea if you actually take coenzyme Q10 in advance and build up your stocks, if you like, of the coenzyme Q10. And it seems to work. We have natural alternatives to atorvastatin, because I do get people who say, I just don't want to take a statin. And the natural alternative is to take lycopene. We use up to 60 milligrams. We use it with a phytosterol sometimes, and we also use it with something that's totally natural. It's made from morning glory, which is field bindweed, which happens to be called C-statin, and there's loads of research on it, and it shows that it restricts angiogenesis, which is what I was talking about, and actually blocks the division of cancer cells. So we can use a statin, coenzyme Q10, or we can use natural compounds. And I'm thinking I'm a bit more circumspect than the doctors who put you on statins straight away if you've got cancer, because I would choose a level. might choose like 4.5 as the level of cholesterol in your body, and below that I might use lycopene. Above it I might use atorvastatin. All depends. I'm not using it anyway. I send them off to a doctor to get it, or go and get their blood levels of fat checked, because it's really, really important. As I said, sugar feeds cancers and fat tends to spread them.
You make it sound
that's my number one.
You make it sound so simple. I understand your number 2 is propranolol.
Propranolol. I've got it all written down, guys. Propranolol. Propranolol is a beta blocker. And there's research, for example, on beta blockers with colorectal cancer, and people live longer and so on. So, there's a group of beta blockers. I think when I looked it all up, there were 17 beta blockers, 4 are for your heart, and about another 13 are for general things. And if you go to your doctor, you say, I've got anxiety, I've got stress, those 2 key words should actually take him on his computer towards the word propranolol. And I first noticed it because 10 years ago, Professor Sood at MD Anderson had women with serous ovarian cancer. Serous is the one that responds to drugs. And he happened to notice, looking back in time, that all the women who had had propranolol for 4 years, who'd all been taking propranolol, actually lived on average 4 years longer than the women who weren't coincidentally on propranolol. So, you got some real evidence. He's the ovarian cancer sort of king at MD Anderson. So I think the issue is not beta blockers. I think the issue is probably propranolol and maybe a couple of others. And when you look down the list of what beta blockers work with cancer, you get 001, 000, 017, and the 17 is propranolol. So it does work with a number of cancers, and it seems to extend survival. Now, there are some people who've raised with me the question that they've heard that it can cause bleeding. And so I went away and looked it up, and I found 3 studies that were linked to propranolol and bleeding. And actually, they all said the opposite. They said that propranolol stopped bleeding. So there you go. That's the power of research. So propranolol is my number 2. There is a natural alternative. There always is. And it's called ashwagandha. And ashwagandha is not just an Ayurvedic herb. It's the queen of Ayurveda. It reduces cortisol stress. Same thing, really. And you take 3 lots of 500 milligrams, and it does a really good job, and it does other things too. So we wouldn't necessarily rush to give people propranolol, but I think it's a really good drug if you're going to take it. And it definitely has got research showing extra survival.
All yours is based on research, isn't it? That's what I find the most comforting.
I'm a boring researcher.
That's the last thing I would say. Right, number 3 I have down as low dose naltrexone.
Yeah, first drug I ever came across. I mean, you got up. We've got wonderful coverage of the off-label drugs on our site. We must have 25, 30 drugs on there. We must knock everybody else into a cocked hat. And I'm even talking about doctors and things like that, and oncology units. And basically, I've been interested in off-label drugs since about 2007, 2006, 2007. And it was sort of two things coming along in the same week. And the first one was I found that there were a bunch of doctors called Clinic 158 in Scotland who were raving about low-dose naltrexone for rheumatoid arthritis. And I was going to put it into Chris Woollams' Health Watch, not Cancer Active. But then I found that there was research in America talking about how low-dose naltrexone could actually boost the immune system and so on in people who got cancer. And the bottom line of it all was that you take naltrexone if you've got problems with addictions or mental problems, but you take 300 milligrams at least, maybe 500, somewhere in there. Low dose naltrexone, you just take 0.5 milligram and you go up to 4.5 milligrams. And what it does do is it's quite good for pain relief, and it's very good for boosting the immune system. So I wrote all this up in 2007. And then suddenly about 4 or 5 years ago, one of the fan club in America, thank you, whoever it was, I can't remember, sent me an article. And there was an American professor raving about it and a Canadian professor raving about it. And they were saying that this is better than any of the new immunotherapies, and it's a damn sight cheaper. And they pointed at a man in London, Professor Angus Dalgleish, doing all the work. And there's a chap who was doing the work specifically for him. And they've shown that actually it works really well if you use CBD oil as well at the same time. So you use LDN, you get yourself up to 4.5, and you use CBD. And it's a really good immune booster, and it's good for pain relief. And certainly that's our experience with it. What I would say to people is you need, as I always say to people, you need a good microbiome, because the microbiome is ultimately responsible for your immune system. And so if you want to have a boost in the immune system, it pays to have a decent microbiome first. But we have suggested it to some people with colorectal cancer right back in 2007. And we actually had 2 of the 3 go back to work with stage 4, grade 4 colorectal cancer. So it was a bit of a result. So I've always liked it. The second thing that came along at that time was, again, Angus Dalgleish. And one of my patients went to Angus for a second opinion. He switched things around in terms of surgery and or in terms of radiotherapy and chemo, and put the woman on metformin because she was grade 4, stage 4. He put the woman on metformin, diabetes drug, cuts your blood sugar, stops the cancer feeding. And if you remember, I was having all that trouble with the skeptics at that time. Chris Woollams dares to say that sugar feeds cancer, and there's Angus Dalgleish putting people on something that cuts their blood sugar. And he put the woman on Atorvastatin, which, as I said, cuts your blood fat, stops the cancer spreading.
You said 2007. You must have been one of the earliest, if not the first, to actually talk about off-label drugs being supporting.
We're often first, Larry. Cancer Active's often first. I was talking about hyperbaric oxygen in about 2004. And, you know, we're on these shows, we're interviewing a Slocum from Istanbul, from the chemotherapy clinic, and he uses it. They've been using it since 2010. We were there 6 years before. Off-label drugs, you know, I suggested to somebody reasonably well known that they built a program of off-label drugs, and they're better now. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. Tell me about antihistamines, Chris.
Right, antihistamines. Antihistamines. Basically, cancer cells on the outside, and all oncologists must know this surely, antihistamines actually have receptor sites on the outside, and they take on board histamines. So cancer cells take on board histamines. What that does is it upregulates them. They become more swollen, they become more sticky, and they become more aggressive. So they're likely to go off around the body and stick to things and form new tumors and things like that. So that's what histamines do with cancer cells. And there was research in about 2002, 2003. It started with a chap at Johns Hopkins noticing that people who had colorectal cancer surgery and happened to be taking cimetidine for their stomach problems as an antihistamine seemed to live longer. And I followed this through, and there's loads of research on it. And there's a lot out of Japan, for example. And cimetidine or Tagamet, which was the drug being given, actually doubles survival time. And they were having problems in Johns Hopkins in those days about how well people did with having had cancer surgery. So it was suggested that they took cimetidine, Tagamet, with patients from day 7 after surgery for a year to increase their survival times. No idea whether they do it, but there was research. And then we got almost the same story from the Karolinska Institute. So the Karolinska Institute, some bright spark there, happened to spot that women with breast cancer, didn't matter whether they're estrogen positive or estrogen negative, that didn't matter at all. They actually survived longer if they happened to be taking an antihistamine in the summer months for their hay fever or allergies. So this is two findings, both by coincidence. And they dug 69,000 women's data out of the files, looking back, retrospective study, and they showed that the one that won was loratadine, American brand Claritin. And if people took that for the 12 weeks of the summer, coincidentally for their hay fever, they actually survived 30% longer. Now, these, as you may remember, we had a guy who used to come up to me in my speeches and say, what you do is the aggregate of marginal gains. And I'm quite happy with that, because he used to say, well, if you can give me 2 years here and another 3 there and another 30% here, I'm going to double my survival time or triple my survival time. So, again, that's what antihistamines do, right? They actually increase your survival time. There is a natural compound, quercetin. I don't really use it. And the reason I don't really use it, because as you accuse me of, I'm a researcher and there ain't much research on it. That's the honest truth. Not research that I would believe.
Right. I mean, just something here, I think it's very, very important. You're talking about the guy saying improving my average survival time, but that's average survival time feeling okay, rather than average survival time feeling like lousy.
Yes, I think that's probably true. I'm not saying for 1 minute that these don't have side effects, these drugs. But by and large, why people looked to off-label drugs in the first place was a lot of people were saying, look, if we wait for the drugs companies, they're going to come up with a new Wizzo XY97. And they're going to do that. It's going to take them 10 years to get that to market. Well, since that drug is supposed to be about cutting fat, stopping angiogenesis or something like that, why don't we use a statin? It's there. It's already available.
Yeah.
And it's been around for 20 years. And as a result, we know what its side effects are. We know what the side effects of statins are. So we don't go into it blind and then find 6 months after it's hit the market, there's a really big problem or anything like that. We know what these things can do, and we know what they can't do, and we know what their side effects might be. So that's really how I think off-label drugs came about.
Okay, number 5 on your list is Accutane or retinoic acid. Talk to me.
Right, this is really interesting, because Accutane is used for acne, and there are a lot of people who don't like Accutane. A lot of doctors in Britain won't prescribe Accutane because of liver concerns. Okay, so let's park it. I get concerned because it does seem to damage the gut. But the basic compound in there is something called retinoic acid. which people would probably know better as vitamin A. They're linked. Vitamin A and retinoic acid are linked. And retinoic acid is in the trans form. And a lot of vitamin A's can be in cis or trans form. Don't even go there. And Accutane is in the cis form, okay? Trans form is much better, right? It's much better in resveratrol and all those sorts of things. Trans form is much more active. And basically, retinoic acid is a teratogen. I think it's teratogen. It's a teratogen, that's the word. And it actually does attack cancer cells, but most importantly, retinoic acid attacks cancer stem cells. And I'm going to come on and talk about somebody in a minute who used it. And basically, cancer stem cells are the problem in cancer, because in the middle of your tumors, we know that you've got cancer stem cells, and no orthodox drug used by any oncologist actually knocks out the cancer stem cells. So you can knock the tumor back 60%, 70% or whatever, but if you don't get rid of the cancer stem cells, it's always likely to regrow. These have the power of renewal, cancer stem cells. And so a lot of people have been looking at off-label drugs saying, how can they knock out cancer stem cells? Can they knock out cancer stem cells? And I'll be honest, I would rather use retinoic acid than Accutane. And you can buy retinoic acid. The natural alternative is vitamin A. Dr. Young S. Kim, who's head of cancer and nutrition at the National Cancer Institute, biggest government body in the world. She buys all their cancer and nutrition. She talks about how vitamin A is one of her 8 compounds for preventing recurrence. So we've got research on it. We've got recommendations from sensible people, and so that's my background to it. We happen to know, and if people want to do it naturally, we happen to know there's probably a dozen natural compounds that can knock out cancer stem cells, and the lead are things like EGCG in green tea, turmeric, resveratrol, sulforaphanes, and I always forget the fifth. Genistin, which is in soy, that terrible thing, just soy. It's not terrible at all. Genistin is an active compound that actually attacks cancer stem cells. So that's the background to it. But I ought to mention doxycycline at this point. Okay, so there's several things that can hit stemness. And another off-label drug is called niclosamide. It also, you have to be very careful how you take it and what you take it with. It doesn't go with fenbendazole, for example. And niclosamide actually does attack cancer cells if they've got a dodgy p53 gene. So it can actually correct cancer cells as well, not just go after cancer stem cells. Doxycycline is a double-edged sword. So doxycycline is used by Care Oncology. We have used it. You probably watched the show with Zoe Wooten. Is now 8 years down the line from having had breast cancer and been given 18 months by the Royal Marsden. And when she had her drugs and she was in her lymph, in 6 lymph nodes and so on, she said, Chris, what can I do? I want to just really knock this out of me. And so I sent her to Care Oncology, and she used Care Oncology's 4 drugs, Metformin, Atorvastatin, mebendazole, and doxycycline. And my thinking is that actually doxycycline, an antibiotic, couldn't have done her much more harm than her drugs were doing at the time. So that's why I used it. Doxycycline's got 2 big studies. Sorry, that big's not the right word, medium studies. But there's a chap called Lisanti. He's done a whole load of studies in test tubes. You put the cancer stem cells in there, you take doxycycline, it knocks out 50% of them. You give the cells a month to recover. You put 50% more doxycycline in, and you knock out 50% of the 50, and you give it a month to recover. And then you put in double dose of doxycycline, and it knocks out, you know, almost 100% of the original number. And he then talked about people using IVC or berberine to kill the rest of those blob cells off. Okay, he also did research where women were about to have breast cancer surgery. And so he gave this lot doxycycline, and this lot didn't have anything. They had pills, sugar pills. And he knocked the stemness back by about 60%. And therein lies the problem with stem cells. So pancreatic cancer, lots of stem cells, number one. Then it's brain tumors and prostate cancer for number two. But all cancers have got stem cells in them. So what happens is, when you're a fetus, you're a blob of cells in the womb, you actually have stem cells. So that's the blob of cells. And they differentiate, using pancreatic enzymes, believe it or not. So baby gets a high dose of pancreatic enzymes at about day 52, and suddenly those cells are turning into liver cells and eye cells and kidney cells and so on. That's what happens in the fetus. And what happens in adults is we all have stem cells, blanks. That's what they are. They're blanks. And so if you cut your arm, shoulder, or whatever, you actually get stem cells rushing there to heal the problem, and they convert into skin cells or blood cells or whatever. So that's fine, except some of them get jammed. And a guy called Wang told us this, and they get jammed because of estrogen. And so estrogen jams them, and they stay in this sort of funny stem-like state, and they become cancer stem cells, and they are renewable, and they just get jammed like that. So it's almost the holy grail. What can knock out cancer stem cells? Answer: 8 to 12 natural compounds, or Accutane, niclosamide, doxycycline, but they all three of those have side effects.
Wow. Ivermectin.
As you know, ivermectin is one of my favorite drugs. We'll probably get kicked off YouTube for saying that straight away. Ivermectin is one of my favorite drugs. And yes, I took it when I had COVID, and I beat COVID at the age of 72. No problem at all. It's another antihelmintic. What's that? It's something that kills worms. And ivermectin, I think, is licensed for horses and dogs, probably. And fenbendazole is licensed for dogs and whatever. But mebendazole is licensed for humans. So that's why oncologists use mebendazole. But I like ivermectin because, yes, it does attack the things that are in worms that also happen to be in cancer cells. And secondly, again, it attacks stemness. It's really, really effective. So it's kind of attacking cancer cells, and it's attacking stemness. And just to put this in context, given all the fuss that's been made about ivermectin, when it was launched, the FDA described it as astonishingly safe. We have the research. So they said it was astonishingly safe, so humans could use it. Okay, so that's two of the things it does. The other thing we like ivermectin for is it overcomes chemo resistance. So if you were to take it at the same time as taking, I don't know, something like an Ibrance, which you are given and you carry on using it for as long as it works, you might find it work longer. That's what chemo resistance does. It stops things working after a while. And ivermectin overcomes chemo resistance. But, you know, we've got research with triple negative breast cancer, melanoma, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer. And as I said, it also kills cancer stem cells. So it actually gets to the root of the problem. Ivermectin.
It's funny, just briefly, I know that the standards in food are higher than they are for dogs, than they are for humans. It takes longer to become a vet than it does to become a doctor. And yet the things that are cleared for animals aren't cleared for us. It's amazing.
Well, it's actually, in a funny way, laziness. So a company might have a compound and it registers them for humans and it gets approved. And they might have one that's similar to it, and they think, well, I better not compete with my own compound. I'll go and register it for animals. So you get that happening. And sometimes people just say, oh, there's enough antihelmintics for humans. Let's go and register another one for horses or something. What's the growing market? Dogs and cats. Well, we'll register it for dogs and cats.
Yeah. Okay. Number 7 is heparin.
All right, I'm being naughty. I'm being naughty. You cannot go to your doctor and say, could you give me some heparin? Right. Heparin is used when you have surgery. And heparin is used to avoid blood clots, which are much more common now than they were 3 or 4 years ago. But I'm not going to give you any answer as to why. And so there are more blood clots around. And so they don't want you to have blood clots when they give surgery, obviously. And so they may well use heparin. And there's a lot of research on heparin showing that actually it gives you 2, 2.5, 3 years more survival over the poor person in the other ward who didn't have heparin when he had his surgery. So I just counsel people to ask their doctor if they're going to be given heparin when they have their surgery, because actually, although there can be a little problem with it, it can cause bleeding. Basically, heparin is a good thing to have as an off-label drug from a surgeon, because you will live longer. So I'm being
Always a good reason. Always a good reason. Valsite.
all right. Again, I'm being naughty. Valsite, if you had a kidney transplant, you would be given valsite, because valsite is a drug and it's used to prevent infection when you have a transplant, for example. Okay, now we move on. Valsite happens to kill something called cytomegalovirus, or at least damage it severely. You may not have heard of cytomegalovirus, but you will have heard of herpes. Herpes 1, herpes 8 gives you cold sores, and people do get herpes and so on. And what happens with herpes is when we contract herpes in our 1925 era, 95, 99% of us get rid of herpes. But 1% don't get rid of the herpes, and it dives into their nerve endings. So it goes and hides in the nervous system. And so people will know that when they get run down, they get cold sores. Well, HPV is the cousin of herpes, so same sort of thing happens. And I have 5 guys in Vancouver at the moment, all of whom have got HPV-driven throat cancer. And it makes me laugh because after about 10 minutes of the PP, they lean forward and whisper to me as if Zoom can't hear. And they go, I've been totally faithful to my wife for 52 years. They're all in their 70s, And I have to explain to them, actually, they got it when they were 20, and it's been hidden ever since. And it comes out to play when their immune system goes down. Cytomegalovirus is exactly the same. It's a cousin of herpes. But in this case, what we're seeing, and it started off, I've been doing a big report on it. We're seeing it with brain tumors. So about 80% of people have got cytomegalovirus in them. It's passive, it's dormant. But it looks like in your glioblastoma or your medulloblastoma, it's actually active. And there's more research on breast cancer and prostate cancer. We know prostate cancer is linked to viruses. And it started off, the research in about 2015 started off by saying that actually it wasn't in the primary tumor for breast cancer, but it was in the metastatic ones. So if you got a secondary in your lungs, almost certainly cytomegalovirus was active in it. And so, okay, I'm using it not the way they use it, prevention. I'm actually seriously looking at whether everybody who has a brain tumor should be given valsite. And so I'm a little bit off my brief, but they have done research with valsite and Avastin. Avastin doesn't work against brain tumors. It actually does make you feel a bit better, but it's failed the let someone survive an extra month or 2 months. It doesn't do that. But they put valsite with Avastin, and lo and behold, people were living 10 months to 18 months longer. And they've just done research on valsite on its own. There is definitely something in this. So if this is a drug currently used only for when people have new kidneys or whatever, I think this is something to bring out of the closet. I really do, which is actually what you're doing with off-label drugs. So I've cheated a bit. So I've two I've cheated on, heparin and valsite, and I definitely think there's an argument for both of them.
Well, I know the next two, the last two you aren't cheating on, because these are the two that my personal favourites that I hear you talking about. The first is melatonin.
Right. I did a speech. I was very, very lucky. I did a speech at a conference, an international conference, and a chap called Russell Rita was there. He's professor at UCLA, and he's kind of the melatonin king. You'll find his name on most bits of research on melatonin. Very briefly, people will say, if you go to the doctor in Britain, you can't get more than 2 or 3 milligrams of it. And the doctor will say, it's the sleeping drug. I've got much better drugs than that. And he probably has. It's not the sleeping drug. That's why. And everybody thinks it is. So if you go from New York to London, you will get jet lag. People take it for jet lag. What it's actually doing, it's one of about 8 hormones that reboots your circadian rhythm, which you need to do because you need to sleep at a different time. But that doesn't make it the sleeping drug. And so your pineal gland, you produce melatonin. You produce it about 45 minutes after you go to sleep. There's your first clue. And secondly, it's the biggest antioxidant we make, and it's very, very anti-inflammatory. It also regulates estrogen and growth hormone in your body. So it actually can stop cancers growing or restrict cancers growing. And it's got about 5 actions against cancer cells. So Russell Reese has been using 60 milligrams 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. No one goes to sleep on him. And he's been looking at using high-dose melatonin as an off-label drug. I have to say, there is one research study from somebody else, but I don't get the impression Russell Reese has cracked it. Let me tell you one more thing, though. You make melatonin during the day. And you make it during the day because of sunlight. And this is why lockdowns were terrible. So what happens is sunlight is made up of the UV end, all those colors in the middle, and the infrared end. The infrared, I think, is about 34% sunlight. And what happens is near infrared goes straight through that big black cloud over Gerrard's Cross and straight through the tree you're sitting under and straight through all your clothes, and it hits your mitochondria and it turns on your mitochondria. And this is really important because your mitochondria, you've got like 1,000 in a cell, and they're the power stations. They're chucking out black smoke all day long. So, of course, because you're eating and you're moving and so on. So they're the equivalent of black smoke. I mean, they don't literally chuck out black smoke. And so you make melatonin by day to clean them up. And the melatonin can't do it all on its own, so it brings up glutathione, and glutathione is made from your greens in your diet and so on. So you've got 2 really powerful antioxidants that clean you up. But melatonin actually is the cleaner upper. That's what it does for you in your body. So it actually attacks cancer cells, and it limits their ability to grow. And it's got about 5 actions against cancer cells. So we like it, and we encourage people to make it by day. In Britain, where you can't get high doses of melatonin, we might use 5-HTP. 5-HTP is tryptophan, and it's the precursor to melatonin. It goes tryptophan, serotonin, melatonin. That's how it goes. And people don't understand that serotonin, about 80-90% of it is made in your gut by gut bacteria in your gut wall, gut lining. And that serotonin makes your melatonin by day. So what you need is the raw materials. So 200 milligrams of 5-HTP for breakfast is a really good way to make sure you make melatonin during the day, just as eating lots of greens is a good way to make sure you make lots of glutathione and clean yourself up. So this is all really, really important. Melatonin, yeah, it's a really big compound.
And the one which, of course, applies to me more than any of them, because I've been on it for years as a diabetic, Metformin.
Okay. I put it in there as it's kind of an also-ran. I'm sorry about calling it an also-ran because a lot of oncologists prescribe it, but they would do. You see, metformin actually cuts your blood sugar, stops the cancer feeding. Metformin also has some research on something called mTOR, which is a pathway, let's say, to cancer. It's got a little bit of research on something called AMPK, which is like the governor of your mitochondria and actually helps to correct a lot of your pathways. It can affect your liver. And it's had a little scandal or three in the last few years about most metformin comes from third world countries and it's not always the purest. Okay, that's part of that. I prefer berberine. And I prefer berberine because berberine is a natural compound. Berberine cuts your blood sugar better than metformin. Berberine definitely, we've got loads of research on berberine. Berberine definitely puts AMPK up and then mTOR down and so on, so it corrects all those. Berberine attacks microbes in the body. Metformin doesn't do that. Berberine is very, very anti-inflammatory, and berberine's also a proven chemosensitizer. Really good for things like triple-negative breast cancer and so on. So berberine, you know, has got more going for it, I think, and so on. And that's where I come back to the one of the first points I made, which is that, you know, the real issue is I want to take people from having a body that's conducive to cancer to one that's conducive to health. And yes, a lot of people have got high blood sugar. A lot of people got high blood fat. Me, I would use berberine every day of the week. But if they really want to use metformin, there's nothing, in my humble opinion, metformin does that berberine doesn't. Let's put it that way. And you get, I mean, I could have in this last number 10, I could have given you other drugs like dipyridamol. Dipyridamol, 3 big studies out of, would you believe, Carl Schulten in about the 80s, 1980s, and melanoma. But what was it doing? They showed that it cut your platelets. Now, this is another issue for hospitals. So, you know, nurses go up to patients and go, your platelets are a bit low. That's really dangerous. You might bleed to death. Well, you might do if they're really, really low. But by and large, people need to understand platelets. So actually, platelets are used by cancer to form blood supplies, to grow, and to spread. So platelets are very useful to cancer. And dipyridamol cuts your platelets. But then so does turmeric. And, you know, as you know, I don't want prostate cancer. So I've been taking 2.5 grams of turmeric for 5 years. Have I got desperately low platelets? Am I bleeding to death? No. So, you know, turmeric does lower your platelets. So you have to be careful. But you wouldn't want to do it for a long time. But dipyridamol works. And so we've seen that. And I think the other one I like is itraconazole. And itraconazole is a drug. It's been used with pancreatic cancer as a research for pancreatic cancer, and it was improving survival times in pancreatic cancer. What does it do? Kills yeast and fungus. What do? What have we done for years with anybody who's got cancer? We've killed the yeast and fungus. We use oregano oil, and we rotate it usually with artemisinin. And we've always done this with pancreatic cancer, right since we started. We've always killed yeast and fungus and E. coli and things like that, right since we started. And so do I need itraconazole? No, I just find the fact that this research wonderfully reassuring that we've been doing the right thing for years. I think overall, I mean, that's my 10, and we'll put them up on screen for people. But, you know, got to remember, there is a point here. I got interested in off-label drugs because Catherine had a brain tumor in 2001, 2002. And there was this chap called Ben Woollams, who was a professor in America. And he was a professor of psychology at San Diego. And he got a GBM, glioblastoma. So, you know, usual. You're lucky if you get 18 months is the kind of way they say it. And he said to the professors of medicine, I'm going to do alternative. And they said, don't be daft. And they said, you can't muck about with the GBM. So he went away and researched the whole thing for about 3 months. And he actually came back and said, no, I'll do the drugs. But what I'm going to do is I've been offered 2 drugs. I want them both. And I'm going to take both drugs, but I'm going to build a program around the outside. And he did exactly what we do. So he used the best things for the job. So, for example, he used tamoxifen and he used melatonin. Well, melatonin attacks cancer cells, which is what we've just told you. But also it's an anti-estrogen. And tamoxifen is an anti-estrogen. And I thought, when I read this research from Ben Woollams, I thought I was the only person who realized estrogen was an issue with brain tumors. And I kept asking Catherine's doctors, could you please stop the estrogen? And we did use things to block the estrogen with Catherine, who, as you know, didn't live 5 months or 18 months. Their record lived nearly 4 years. So that's what I did. So to use 2 off-label drugs, yeah, okay, fine. And he used, I mean, there's some talk that he used mebendazole, but that's kind of not what's in his book. He used Accutane, which I've talked about. He was after the stem cells. And he used cimetidine, Tagamet, which, you know, actually is the antihistamine. And that does, we know, restrict cancer spread, and you're far more likely to live longer and so on. And he used something called verapamil, which is a calcium blocker. And actually, what does that do? It actually overcomes drug resistance. So everything I've been talking about, estrogen, you know, attack the cancer stem cells, actually protect yourself against drug resistance and so on. So that's what he did. But then around the outside of that, he put a whole lot of supplements, and he was using things like genistein. He was really after his cancer stem cells. And then he did herbs and things like this. So he kind of built these concentric circles. And he said something which I find absolutely crucial. He said something, he said that, you know, if you take something like GBM and you throw a drug at it, he said, you'll kill 95% of it, but 5% will move north. And then he said, you chuck another drug at it and you'll kill 95% of it, but 5% will move east. And you chuck another drug at that and 5% will move south. And you're forever sort of playing this chasing game, but 5% survives and carries on and renews and so on. And that's what happens in GBM. It's what happens in any cancer. And, you know, I talked to Henry Friedman, who's the cancer brain tumor guy in Dukes in Carolina. He's now, they've got a special center, the Preston Robert Tisch Center. And Friedman's actually on record as saying it's naive of anybody to believe that a drug is going to kill a cancer, let alone one as dangerous as GBM. And this is what they both were basically saying. They were saying what I do. They were saying programs beat cancer. So you built a body conducive to cancer. You probably, it wasn't one thing, it was 6 things that you did. And what I try and do is I don't treat cancer. One of my patients, Farouz, she invited us to dinner that time down in Marbella. And Farouz actually said, I've got you worked out. You don't treat cancer. He said, you treat people. I rebuild people. And I want something that's going to cut. I want something that's going to put their oxygen up. I want something that's going to put their vitamin D up to about 125. I want something that cuts their blood sugar. I want something that cuts their blood fat. I want an antihistamine. I want to fix their gut. I want something for their stress management and so on. You know, it's half a dozen things. But I start from the basis of what do I want to do? And secondly, what is the best compound to do it? But I don't say, right, I'm going to build an off-label drugs protocol. I did it once in my life because someone said, I'm dead if we don't do something different. So I did. They are.
You know, unbelievable. The title of this show is Cancer. It's not all doom and gloom. It is if you ignore it. It is if you don't do anything about it. And it is if you do the wrong things. But I'll tell you something, my friend, the information you give people and the way that you give it based on research that you've spent hours and days and months and years doing is just so phenomenal. And I would just say to everybody listening to this show that you may listen to this as a one-off show. I urge you, join Cancer Active, become a member and get access to all the shows. There is phenomenal information there, and you owe it to yourself to have all the information that you can possibly have. Chris, that was fantastic. Thank you.
Well, I mean, there's 8 shows this week, aren't there? I mean, 8 shows this week, and everybody's going to be talking like I've been talking. They're going to be saying, look, you could try this, you could try this. And I think that's the biggest issue that orthodox medicine faces at the moment. We've got more weaponry. That's what I would honestly say. We've got more weaponry because they're less likely to do the things that we might do. And, you know, you get doctors who say, but if it worked, don't you think we'd use it? And do you know what the answer to that is? No, I don't think you would.
No.
But you've seen it this year. I mean, this has been a watershed, hasn't it? I mean, so many people this year beating their cancer. It's phenomenal.
You know, when I've met people at your speeches who survived for 8 and 10 years, and they're given 6 months or 6 weeks, it's just incredible. Incredible. Chris, fantastic. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. I hope everybody got something out of it. It wasn't meant to be an in-depth look. It was just meant to be an overview on 10 drugs, 10 off-label drugs. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. All the best. I hope everybody watches the rest of the shows.
So do I, for their sake.
Bye. Thank you, Larry. Thank you for doing it. Bye.
Cheers.